Draw two lines on a graph. The first line is the population of the Phoenix metropolitan area, and it climbs, decade after decade, one of the steepest and most relentless upward lines in the entire country. A desert region that has grown from a modest town into a sprawling metropolis of millions and shows little sign of stopping. Adding people and houses and subdivisions at a pace that has made it one of the fastest growing places in the United States. The second line is the water available to keep all of those people alive in the middle of a desert. And it does the opposite. It falls. The great river that supplies a large share of the region's water is shrinking under a decades-long drought that scientists now call a permanent drying. The ancient groundwater beneath the desert is finite and being drawn down. The supply line, taken as a whole, is bending downward at the very moment the demand line is still climbing. And there is a name for what happens when a line that is going up meets a line that is going down. They cross. The only questions are where and when and what it means for the millions of people living in the space between them. This is a story about those two lines and about the brutal arithmetic of a city that keeps growing while the water keeping it alive keeps shrinking. An arithmetic that the state of Arizona has already, in its own official numbers, admitted does not add up. Picture a family standing on a patch of raw desert at the edge of the metropolis, the kind of place where the city has been marching outward for decades, one ring of new rooftops after another pushing into the creosote and the dust. They came to build a home, drawn by the same promise that drew millions before them: cheap land at the desert's edge, a new house, a piece of the booming Sunbelt dream. And they discover something their predecessors never had to face, which is that the state will not certify that there is enough water to serve a new subdivision here. Because the groundwater beneath this particular stretch of desert is already promised elsewhere, already counted against other homes, already found insufficient to guarantee the 100 years of supply that the law requires. The land is there. The demand is there. The builders are ready. What is missing is the water, and its absence has quietly closed a door that stood open for generations. That family is standing at the exact place where the two lines meet, at the leading edge of the arithmetic, in a spot where the growth that defined this region for a century has simply been told no, not by a court or a protest, but by the water itself, or rather by the honest accounting of how little of it is left. They are among the first to feel it. They will not be the last, because the same math that stopped their subdivision is working its way inward from the fringe toward the whole region, one hard limit at a time. Let me be fair and clear from the start, because this is a story that is easy to tell dishonestly and important to tell accurately. Phoenix is not a city that is about to run dry next week, and anyone who tells you it is selling fear rather than truth. Phoenix is in fact one of the most sophisticated and well-managed water cities in the country, a place that has spent decades planning for exactly this problem, banking water underground, slashing its per-person water use, building a portfolio of supplies and a web of rules that make it far more resilient than its desert location would suggest. That competence is real, and it matters. And it is part of why the collision of these two lines is a slow motion problem rather than an immediate catastrophe. But competence is not the same as escape. Good management can slow the approach of the two lines, can push the crossing point further into the future, can soften the blow when it comes. What it cannot do is repeal the arithmetic, because the arithmetic is not about management. It is about the fundamental impossibility of adding people forever to a place whose water is subtracting, and that impossibility does not care how well the city is run. The brutal math is brutal precisely because it survives even the best efforts to manage around it, and Phoenix, for all its genuine skill, is running headlong into it. To understand the math, you first have to understand where Phoenix gets its water, because the vulnerability is built into the mix. The region draws its water from several sources, and each one is under its own kind of pressure. A large share comes from the Colorado River, delivered across the desert through a massive canal system that lifts the water hundreds of miles from the river to the cities of central Arizona. Another large share comes from rivers closer to home, the Salt and the Verde, captured behind a system of dams in the mountains and reservoirs that store the seasonal flows. Some comes from groundwater, the water stored in the aquifers beneath the desert floor, accumulated over thousands of years. And a growing share comes from reclaimed water, wastewater cleaned and reused for irrigation and industry and recharge. On paper, that diversity looks like strength, a portfolio that does not depend on any single source. But the diversity hides a problem, which is that the two largest renewable sources, the Colorado and the local rivers, are both fundamentally dependent on precipitation in a drying climate, and the groundwater that is supposed to be the backstop is finite, and in many places being used faster than it is replaced. When you look closely, the portfolio is not as diversified as it appears, because nearly all of it traces back, in the end, to water that is either shrinking or running out. The Colorado River piece is the most immediately threatened, and it is where the shrinking is happening fastest. The river has been in the grip of a profound drought for more than 2 decades, its flows declining as the climate warms, its great reservoirs falling toward record lows. And the states that share it have been forced into painful negotiations over how to cut back their use. And here is where Arizona's particular vulnerability comes in, because among the users of the Colorado, the canal system that carries water to Phoenix and central Arizona holds one of the most junior priorities, which means that when the river is short and cuts must be made. This system is among the first to lose water and loses it in the largest proportions. Arizona agreed to that junior status long ago in exchange for getting the canal built at all, a bargain that made sense when the river seemed abundant and looks very different now that it is shrinking. So as the Colorado declines and the cuts deepen, the water delivered to central Arizona through that canal is reduced first and reduced most, which means the single largest renewable pillar of Phoenix's supply is also the one most exposed to the river's decline, taking the deepest cuts precisely as the region's population keeps climbing. In the driest years, and the region has been heading into some of the driest on record, those cuts bite hard, and they fall on the growing city with the most junior claim. Then there is the groundwater, and the groundwater is where the state itself has already admitted the math does not work. For a long time, the assumption underpinning Phoenix's growth was that even if the surface water fluctuated, the vast aquifers beneath the desert could serve as a reliable backstop, and much of the region's development was built on the promise of that groundwater. Arizona even has a law, decades old and genuinely forward-thinking for its time, requiring that new developments in the most populated areas demonstrate an assured water supply, a guarantee of enough water to serve the development for 100 years, precisely so that people would not build homes that would run dry. For years, groundwater was allowed to count toward that 100-year guarantee. But then the state did something that broke the comfortable assumption. It built a new, more accurate model of exactly how much groundwater actually lay beneath the Phoenix area, and how much was already promised to existing and planned development, and the model delivered a stark verdict. There was not enough. The groundwater beneath the region, the state's own analysis concluded, could not satisfy all of the demand that was already planned to draw on it over the coming century, falling short by an enormous volume. And so, on the strength of its own numbers, the state stopped approving new developments in parts of the metropolitan fringe that would have relied solely on groundwater, freezing a category of growth because the water to support it simply was not there. That was not an environmentalist's projection or an activist's warning. It was the state government of Arizona looking at its own aquifer and concluding that the groundwater could not support the growth that was planned on it. And it is worth understanding what that groundwater actually is, because the word backstop makes it sound far more renewable than it is. The water in the aquifers beneath the Phoenix area is in large part ancient, accumulated over thousands of years when the climate was wetter, seeping down grain by grain into the porous rock and sand over a span of time that dwarfs all of human history. In the present climate, it is being replenished only very slowly, far more slowly than it is being pumped out, which means that using it is less like drawing on a renewing supply and more like draining a reservoir that took millennia to fill and will not refill on any timescale that matters to a living person. Water experts have a word for this. They call it mining, because that is what it functionally is: the extraction of a finite, essentially non-renewable resource that, once removed, is gone for practical purposes forever. Every acre-foot of ancient groundwater pumped to water a new lawn or cool a new data center is an acre-foot that will not be replaced in any of our lifetimes or our grandchildren's, a withdrawal from a savings account that receives almost no new deposits. This is why the state's finding matters so much and cuts so deep. The groundwater was never a bottomless well or a self-refilling backstop. It was a one-time inheritance, a vast but finite gift from a wetter past, and the region has been spending it, and the state has now measured how much remains and concluded that it cannot cover the bills already written against it. Sit with what that means, because it is the clearest possible statement of the brutal math. The assumption for generations was that Phoenix could keep growing outward, subdivision by subdivision, on the strength of the water beneath it. The state measured that water carefully and found that the assumption was false, that the groundwater was already overpromised, that continuing to build on it as before would mean guaranteeing 100 years of water that did not exist. And so a form of growth that had been the default for decades, sprawling development on groundwater at the desert's edge, was brought to a halt by the arithmetic itself. This is what it looks like when the two lines begin to touch. Not a dramatic day of empty taps, but a quiet official finding that a certain kind of growth can no longer be watered. A door closing on the assumption that the desert could be built upon indefinitely. The groundwater backstop, the thing that was supposed to make the whole system safe, turned out to be already spoken for, and the state had to say so out loud. And the pressure on the riverside is intensifying right now, not in some distant projection, but in the current year, which is tightening the whole equation further. The Colorado has been heading into one of its driest stretches on record, and the federal government and the basin states have been working out the rules that will govern the river in the coming era. A new framework for how the shrinking flows will be divided and how deep the cuts will go, with the old operating guidelines expiring and everything up for renegotiation. Arizona has been bracing for the prospect of significant additional reductions to its Colorado supply. The city's warned to prepare. The officials challenging and maneuvering over federal plans that could deepen the cuts to the canal that feeds Phoenix. This is the shrinking side of the math accelerating in real time, the river delivering less, and the rules being rewritten to allocate that shortage, with Central Arizona's junior priority, meaning it stands to absorb a painful share of whatever cuts are imposed. So the supply line is not merely drifting gently downward on some long geological schedule. It is being actively stepped down, year by year and negotiation by negotiation, as the river's decline forces the hard reallocation of a resource that no longer stretches to cover the promises made on it, and Phoenix sits downstream of every one of those decisions, its largest renewable supply shrinking on a schedule set by drought and by the difficult politics of scarcity. And yet, even with the river shrinking and the groundwater overpromised, the growth continues, which is the other half of the collision. The Phoenix region remains one of the fastest growing in the country, and the forces driving that growth are powerful and show little sign of weakening. People keep moving there for the warmth, the relative affordability, the jobs, the sprawling new neighborhoods that keep rising at the edges of the metropolis. And the economy the region has courted is, in some cases, extraordinarily thirsty. Phoenix has aggressively recruited advanced manufacturing, including enormous semiconductor factories, and the data centers that power the digital economy, and these facilities can consume staggering quantities of water. The chip plants for their ultra-pure manufacturing processes, and the data centers for their cooling. So even as the water supply tightens, the region is adding not just people, but some of the most water-intensive industry there is, deliberately, as a matter of economic strategy, betting that the water can be found to serve them. The growth line, in other words, is not slowing to meet the shrinking supply. It is, in some respects, accelerating, driven by migration and by an industrial policy that piles new heavy demands on top of the residential ones, all of it climbing while the river falls and the aquifer empties. Now put the two together, and the collision comes into focus. On one side, a supply that is bending downward, the Colorado shrinking and taking its deepest cuts precisely from the canal that feeds central Arizona, the groundwater officially found insufficient for the growth already planned on it, the local rivers subject to the same drying climate. On the other side, a demand that keeps climbing. More people, more houses. More of the thirstiest industry on earth, growth driven by momentum and money, and the enduring dream of the desert city. These two trends cannot both continue indefinitely, because they are on a collision course, and the collision has, in a limited way, already begun in the frozen subdivisions at the desert's edge, and the deepening cuts to the Colorado deliveries, and the increasingly tense fights over who gives up how much water. The brutal math is simply the recognition that you cannot add demand forever to a supply that is subtracting, that at some point the growing need and the shrinking resource must meet, and that when they do, something has to give. Either the growth stops, or the water runs short, or the region finds some way to fundamentally change the equation. So far, it has been changing it at the margins, freezing the most exposed growth, squeezing more out of conservation, but the underlying lines are still pointed at each other, and the space between them is narrowing. And for some people on the edges of the metropolis, the abstraction has already become a daily reality, a preview of what scarcity feels like when it arrives at an individual home. On the fringe of the region, there have been communities that grew up in the unincorporated desert without their own secured water supply, relying instead on water hauled in by truck, purchased from a nearby city, and trucked out to fill household tanks. And when the drought deepened and the nearby city decided it needed to protect its own supply for its own residents, some of those haulers were cut off, leaving households in an affluent, modern American metropolitan area suddenly without a reliable source of water. Forced to scramble for trucked-in supplies at higher prices from further away, to ration what they had, to confront the raw fact that the water they had taken for granted was simply no longer guaranteed to arrive. It became a bitter, drawn-out fight over who was responsible for supplying them, and on what terms, a small crisis that made national news precisely because it was so startling. People in a wealthy suburb of a booming city rationing water, hauled by truck in the 21st century. That episode is a miniature of the whole problem. The moment when the comfortable assumption of endless water met the hard limit of a shrinking supply, and real families, not statistics, found themselves on the wrong side of the line. It was a small and local version of the collision, but it was the collision nonetheless, arriving early at the most exposed edge, a warning of what it looks like when the math stops being a graph and starts being a tap that no longer fills. This is the point where honesty requires giving Phoenix its due, because the reason the collision has not yet been catastrophic is that the region has genuinely done a great deal right, and pretending otherwise would misrepresent the situation. Over the decades that its population multiplied, Phoenix and the cities around it actually reduced their total or per-person water use through serious conservation, so that the region today uses water far more efficiently than it once did, having decoupled some of its growth from its water consumption in a way that is genuinely impressive. It banked water underground during the wetter years, storing vast quantities of Colorado water in the aquifers, precisely to draw on during shortages, building an underground savings account measured in millions of acre-feet. It built extensive systems to reclaim and reuse wastewater, and it developed one of the more sophisticated frameworks of water law and management in the country. The very framework that produced the honest groundwater model and the halt on unsupported growth. All of this is real, and it is why Phoenix is far better positioned than many other desert cities, why it can absorb cuts and shortages that would devastate a less prepared place, why the crossing of the two lines has been pushed further out and softened rather than allowed to arrive all at once. The competence buys time, and time is valuable, and it would be wrong to tell this story as if the city were sleepwalking toward disaster. It is not. It is fighting, intelligently and hard. But, and this is the heart of it, all of that skill changes the timing of the math without changing the math itself. Conservation can lower the demand line, but it cannot make it point downward forever while the population climbs, because there is a floor below which people cannot reduce their water use and still live, and a growing population eventually pushes total demand back up even at high efficiency. Banked groundwater can cover shortfalls, but a savings account is finite, drawn down each time it is used. A buffer against the crossing rather than a repeal of it. Reclaimed water helps, but it is ultimately limited by the amount of water coming into the system in the first place, which is the very thing that is shrinking. Every one of these tools is a way of managing the gap between the rising demand and the falling supply, of stretching the resource and delaying the reckoning. And every one of them is genuinely valuable. But not one of them adds water to a drying river or refills an aquifer on any human timescale, and so not one of them changes the fundamental direction of the two lines. They change how fast the lines approach and how hard the impact, and those are not small things. But the lines are still approaching, and the best managed desert city in the country is still at bottom a place trying to reconcile endless growth with shrinking water, which is a circle that management can shrink but cannot square. And so the region faces a set of choices that get harder the longer they are deferred. Choices that are really about which part of the impossible equation is allowed to break. One option is to let the growth slow, to accept that the era of endless outward sprawl on the desert is ending, that the region cannot keep adding people and industry at the old pace without water it does not have, and to build a future around stability rather than perpetual expansion, a wrenching adjustment for an economy and a culture built entirely on growth. Another option is to find new water, to pay for expensive and difficult new supplies, desalinated water piped from distant seas, water bought from farmers who follow their fields, deals and pipelines and technologies that could add to the supply but at enormous cost and with no guarantee of sufficiency. Another is to take water from agriculture, which uses the majority of the region's water to grow crops, shifting it to the cities and the factories, a transfer that could free up large volumes but would remake the rural economy and raise hard questions about food and fairness. Each of these paths is difficult, expensive, or painful, and each represents a different answer to the same brutal question the math is posing. Which part of the dream of the growing desert city are you willing to give up, because the water to sustain all of it no longer exists? What makes these choices so agonizing is that each of them cuts against something the region deeply wants. Slowing the growth means throttling the very engine that has powered Arizona's prosperity for generations. Telling an economy built on expansion that expansion must end, a message no growth-dependent place ever wants to hear, and every politician is tempted to defer to a successor. Buying new water through desalination or long pipelines means costs so vast they would reshape water bills and public budgets for decades, spending enormous sums to import what the desert cannot provide. Taking water from agriculture means unmaking rural communities and the farms that feed part of the country, pitting city against countryside in a fight over a resource both need. There is no painless path, no clever fix that lets the region keep everything it has while quietly solving the shortage, and that is exactly why the hard decisions keep being postponed. Because every one of them requires giving something up, and a growing, optimistic, prosperous region is the last kind of place that wants to believe it must start subtracting. But the arithmetic does not wait for willingness, and every year of deferral narrows the space in which the choice can still be made on the region's own terms. There is a larger significance to Phoenix's predicament that reaches well beyond Arizona, because Phoenix is, in a sense, the test case for a question the whole warming, drying, growing world is going to have to answer. Can a great modern city thrive in a desert indefinitely on a shrinking supply of water through sheer ingenuity and management? Phoenix is running that experiment in real time, with millions of lives riding on the outcome, and the honest answer so far is that we do not yet know. The optimistic case is that human cleverness, conservation, reuse, new supplies, and smart policy can keep stretching the water far enough to sustain a stable, prosperous desert metropolis, even as the climate dries. That the two lines can be bent toward each other gently enough to meet at a sustainable equilibrium rather than a crisis. The pessimistic case is that there are hard physical limits that no amount of cleverness can overcome, that a desert can support only so many people on so little water, and that a region which keeps growing past that limit is simply borrowing against a future that will eventually come due. The truth is probably somewhere in between. A future in which Phoenix neither collapses dramatically nor grows freely, but is forced, gradually and perhaps painfully, to live within the real limits of its water, to become a different and more constrained version of itself than the boundless boomtown of its past. So return, at the end, to the two lines on the graph. The population line climbing, still climbing, driven by all the momentum of a booming region and a hungry economy. The water line falling, the river shrinking, the aquifer overpromised, the local rivers drying, the supply bending downward under a permanently warming sky. For a long time, those two lines seemed to have nothing to do with each other. The growth a story of success, and the water a technical matter handled quietly by engineers and managers in the background. But they were always the same story, and now they are visibly converging, close enough that the state has had to freeze growth it cannot water, close enough that the cuts to the river bite each year, close enough that the once abstract question of what happens when they meet has become a live and pressing one. Phoenix is not going to vanish, and it is not going to run dry tomorrow, and its genuine skill will carry it further than most. But the math is the math, and the math is brutal, because a city cannot grow forever on water that keeps shrinking and somewhere ahead. Closer now than it used to be, the line that keeps climbing and the line that keeps falling are going to cross. The only choice the region really has is whether to meet that crossing on its own terms, by bending the lines with foresight and hard decisions made in time, or to meet it on the desert's terms, when the water simply is not there and the arithmetic finishes the argument that the growth would not.